Greetings, taxable assets. Or should I say collateral damage?
The Vox feed is currently live, sir. We are recording the deep dive.
I am well aware the feed is live.
Yeah.
The civilian contractor Mini Wargaming has sent us this garbage. A so-called battle report designated a saga of fire and frost. Space wolves versus Tyranids. A complete structural failure.
Yes, sir. Episode 80 in their archive.
You have been found severely lacking in your tidings to the strategic archives of Beyond the Bolter. To rectify this spiritual and tactical deficit, you must strike the like button and engage the notification bell immediately.
It is highly recommended for optimal data retention.
This is not a request. It is a required protocol to ensure your databanks remain current and to halt these glass-brained battlefield maneuvers. If left unchecked, this profound intellectual rot will inevitably deposit you at the front doors of Vanguard Tactics or Art of War 40k.
Which, the Departamento Analytica flags as a severe financial drain.
Exactly. There, they will happily exact a $500 toll for a rudimentary coaching course, exploiting a structural failure born entirely of your own abysmal attention spans.
A very heavy toll, sir.
You find yourselves in this deficit simply because you were too busy snorting substandard corpse starch, rendering you physically incapable of sitting still and listening to Valarius Krauss for a measly 45 minutes.
We just need them to listen to the audit.
Heed this audit. Absorb the mathematics, cease making these catastrophic glass-brained mistakes, and stop getting yourselves mathematically tabled. Now, open the ledger.
Yes, right away. I have the ledger prepared and open to the foundational deployment data.
Good. Let's look at the starting capital.
We are reviewing the structural assets committed by the Mini Wargaming Space Wolf Commander, designated Luca, and the Tyranid Commander, designated Trey.
Read me the Tyranid defensive floor. Start with the biological reclamation engines. I want to establish exactly how this systemic operational deficit was manufactured before a single piece of plastic was placed on the terraformed rock.
Reviewing the Tyranid Crusher Stampede roster now. The foundation is built entirely on hyper-dense biological armor.
Provide the specifics. Don't skim the number.
Right. The Haruspex. Operational cost is approximately 125 points. Chassis metrics are Toughness 9, an armor save of 3+, and 14 wounds.
A heavy asset for loose change. Continue.
Then we have the Swarm Lord, acting as the Apex command node. Operational cost is 240 points. Its metrics sit at Toughness 10, a 2+ armor save, a 4+ invulnerable save, and 10 wounds.
Standard command grade durability. What else?
The Hive Tyrant, the Synaptic Lieutenant, mirrors that defensive profile. Toughness 10, a 2+ save, and a 4+ invulnerable save. Moving to the heavy artillery, the Tyranids heavy ordnance platform.
The mobile bunker?
Yes, exactly. Toughness 10, a 2+ save, and an astounding 16 wounds. Finally, the true area denial Bastion's 2 Norn emissaries were deployed.
Read their physical footprint. Slowly. I want these civilians to really feel the mathematical weight of this wall.
Their defensive footprint is towering. Toughness 11, a 2+ armor save, a 4+ invulnerable save, 16 wounds, and an embedded 5+ feel no pain damage mitigation matrix when sitting on their staked objective.
So toughness 9, 10, and 11 across the board, an absolute biological fortress. And what does the Space Wolf ledger show us for their primary infantry? Read the armaments meant to crack this chitinous vault.
Looking at the Space Wolf ledgers, the primary infantry consists of Blood Claws, functioning as assault infantry. Their primary armament is the Astartes chainsword, which operates at Strength 4.
Strength 4. Brilliant. Keep going.
They are supported by an Intercessor squad, acting as a line-holding asset. Their primary armament is the Bolt Rifle, also at Strength 4.
Just piling on the redundancy, aren't they?
Finally, the Terminator squad, classified as heavy assault infantry. Their primary ranged armament is the Storm Bolter. Also, Strength 4.
Strength 4 into Toughness 11. That's not a weapon scribe, that's a rounding error.
But if we factor in the Adeptus Astartes faction rule, Oath of Moment...
Do not bring up Oath of Moment.
Boot, but they are granted full rerolls to hit against a designated target. Surely, the sheer volume of attacks, combined with the mathematical consistency of those rerolls, generates enough localized lethality to bypass the toughness disparity. I mean, a chainsword revving tens of thousands of times a minute must eventually cut through, right?
That is precisely the pedestrian logic that bankrupts armies and fills graveyards. You are describing the illusion of probability. Let me aggressively detail exactly how the Tyranid commander forced a symmetrical game of pure, blunt force mathematics and why your reliance on, quote, volume, unquote, is a statistical fallacy.
A statistical fallacy. But the dice...
By adopting the Crusher Stampede detachment and fielding exclusively high-cost behemoths, the Tyranid player liquidated quantity to raise the absolute floor of the engagement to Toughness 9, 10, and 11. Do you understand what that means for the underlying physics of a 10-sided or 6-sided probability matrix?
Well, it shifts the required wound roll heavily to the right of the bell curve.
It doesn't just shift it. It obliterates it. It turns off 80% of the Space Wolf data sheets.
80%. Just from the toughness stat alone.
Yes. Look, the Space Marines are designed to be a hyperdynamic force. They rely on complex, interlocking synergies, target prioritization, and rapid repositioning. A chainsword, a bolt rifle, and a storm bolter all function dynamically against Toughness 4 infantry, wounding on a 4+.
Right, which is a 50% success rate per hit.
Exactly. But when the target floor is raised to Toughness 11, a Strength 4 weapon requires a roll of a 6 to wound. That is a 16.6% success rate.
Ooh, that is a severe deficit.
You can have all the Oath of Moment rerolls to hit in the galaxy, but if only 16% of your successful hits actually threaten the armor, your mathematical output flatlines. You're throwing pebbles at a plasteel blast door. What did the Space Wolves bring to counter this? Read me the dedicated anti-tank ordnance.
Let me find that section. The Space Wolf list utilized their elite melee unit, the Terminator Power Fists. These operate at Strength 8. Against the critical Toughness 10 and Toughness 11 Tyranid command nodes,
they wound on 5s. A premium elite melee unit that costs 175 points for 5 models. These are meant to act as surgical sledgehammers, dropping via teleport strike, and they are mathematically suppressed into a 33% success rate on the wound roll. Continue the audit.
Moving to the ranged support, it relies on the Redemptor Dreadnought. 2 units were deployed, operational cost roughly 210 points each.
And their primary armament?
Their primary armament is the Macroplasma Incinerator. In its supercharged state, it fires at Strength 9, against the Toughness 10 and 11 profiles.
Again, wounding on 5s. You are bringing chainswords and mid-tier plasma coils to a structural demolition site.
But historically, plasma has been highly effective against heavy armor.
In previous editions of the tactical manual, yes, Strength 8 and 9 were the gold standard for cracking vehicle armor. But in the current operational environment, the toughness scale was vastly expanded to stretch up to Toughness 14.
Right, the new system parameters.
Exactly. Strength 8 and 9 weaponry plummeted into an uncanny valley. They are too strong for light infantry, but critically underpowered against heavy biological armor. The Space Wolf list suffered from a terminal lack of focused, high-strength heavy weaponry.
Let me check the transport bays. No Eradicators logged.
I see no Eradicators with their Strength 9 melter rifles and native rerolls to wound. I see no Gladiator Lancers equipped with Strength 14 laser destroyers that effortlessly bypass Toughness 11. The commander lacked comparable heavy-range assets and attempted to solve a structural engineering problem with an abundance of low-yield, localized violence.
I must interject, the ledger does show the Brutalis Dreadnought classified as a siege engine. It was equipped with Brutalis Talons operating at Strength 12.
Let me see that.
That profile wounds Toughness 10 on a 3+ and Toughness 11 on a 3+. That is a highly lethal, mathematically reliable asset, is it not?
And because it was a singular, isolated threat, it was functionally relevant. It was the only asset in the entire Space Wolf list capable of reliably wounding the Tyranid heavy armor.
So it became an obvious target.
The Tyranid player identified the singular point of failure and simply deleted it early with the Haruspex. We will get to that slaughter shortly. The overarching point is this. The Tyranid list simply asked a mechanical question at the deployment phase.
What question, sir?
Do you possess enough Strength 10 or higher weaponry to remove 60+ wounds of Toughness, 10+ armor before the 4th operational cycle? The Space Wolf list mathematically did not. The ledger was bankrupt from the moment the miniatures were unpacked.
Bankrupt before turn 1, that is grim.
Turn the page to the turn 1 combat logs. I want to expose the illusion of action.
Opening the turn 1 records now. The Mini Wargaming's Space Wolves execute their preliminary maneuvers. A scout squad cleanses an objective to secure secondary points.
Typical busy work. Get to the primary engagement zone.
Right. The Brutalis Dreadnought advances 13 inches up the flank. Then, the Space Wolves invest overwhelming operational resources into bringing down the central Norn Emissary. They execute an exhaustive sequence of concentrated fire.
Define exhaustive.
A 10-man Intercessor squad focuses all of their output 40 bolt rifle shots directly into the Norn Emissary. They score multiple hits, triggering target elimination 6s and force numerous saves.
And remind the listeners of the Norn Emissary's defensive profile against this barrage.
Toughness 11. It possesses a 2+ armor save, which was benefiting from terrain cover, meaning the armor penetration minus one of the bolt rifles essentially bounced off.
Complete structural negation.
Furthermore, it utilizes a 5+ feel no pain rule generated from its singular purpose objective directive. After the 40 bolt rifle shots resolve, the Space Wolves stick a mathematically minimal fraction of damage, taking the Emissary down to just 15 wounds.
40 shots. 1 damage.
Yes. They immediately follow up by activating the Redemptor Dreadnought, firing the Macroplasma Incinerator. It generates 7 shots. As established, it requires 5s to wound.
The uncanny valley of plasma. Let's hear the pathetic outcome.
It pushes 4 wounds through. The Norn Emissary utilizes its 4+ invulnerable save, failing 2 of them. This translates to 6 potential damage.
And then the biological mitigation layers kick in.
Correct. The Tyranid commander then rolls the 5+ feel no pain mitigations, successfully saving 2 more points of damage. The Emissary is left with 11 wounds remaining. Frustrated by the lack of ranged output, the Space Wolves then declare a physical charge with the Redemptor Dreadnought and the Blood Claws into the Emissary.
Throwing 40 strength 4 attacks into a 5+ feel no pain isn't a tactic. It's penny stock violence. You're trying to bankrupt a planetary governor with loose change.
Penny stock violence. I will log that term.
Those bolters should have been firing at secondary scoring units, not the heaviest armor on the board.
Yeah.
You listening right now, you do the exact same thing on your dining room tables. You see a massive, terrifying model in the center of the board, and your monkey brain hyperfixates on it. You pour thousands of rounds of useless, mathematically impotent crossfire into it, achieving absolutely nothing while your opponent quietly scores victory points on the merge.
The physical charge of the Blood Claws also encountered friction. They failed their initial charge distance, requiring the expenditure of a vital command point for a tactical reroll just to complete the physical engagement.
An engagement they never should have initiated. Let me introduce you to the concept of the 1-inch denial sphere. Read me the physical base sizes of the Tyranid assets from the Departmental Analytica files. Do not skip the measurements.
Accessing biological geometry files. The Norn Emissary operates on a 100mm circular base. The Haruspex, Exocrine, and Tyranifex chassis all utilize massive 120 by 92mm oval bases.
Exactly. But a model's true geometric footprint in the tactical framework of the current rule set is not just the plastic base. It includes the 1-inch engagement range bubble that surrounds it entirely.
Which represents the immediate threat proximity.
Yes. In imperial measurements, 1 inch translates to exactly 25.4 millimeters. Enemy models are strictly forbidden from entering this invisible bubble during the movement phase unless they are actively declaring a melee charge.
So it artificially extends their physical block.
Therefore, if you take a single 120 millimeter oval base and you add 25.4 millimeters to the front and 25.4 millimeters to the back, that single biological entity effectively projects a physical blockade nearly 170.8 millimeters wide. I'm diagramming this for you now. Look at the ledger.
Oh, I see. If placed horizontally across a transit lane, it creates a massive geometric wall. It projects a physical zone of absolute denial.
It's a choke point plug. Standard competitive terrain layouts, specifically the ones mandated by the Leviathan tournament packets utilized in this exact battle report, feature highly specific alleys and transit vectors between line-of-sight blocking ruins.
The engineered firing lanes?
Yes. The gaps between these ruins are generally designed to be 4 to 6 inches wide. A 170 millimeter denial footprint translates to roughly 6.7 inches.
Which is larger than the actual gap in the terrain.
By simply marching these 120 millimeter bases into these specific lanes, the Tyranid player did not even need to roll dice or engage in melee to stop the Space Wolves. They simply plugged the geometrical arteries of the board. The Tyranid models ceased to be mere combatants. They effectively became walking, indestructible terrain pieces. The Space Wolves weren't just mathematically defeated, they were geographically choked.
Does this geometric suppression account for the clumping of the Space Marine forces observed in the Turn 2 aerial picked captures?
It resulted in the total pathfinding collapse of the Adeptus Astartes. A hyperdynamic force requires fluid transit vectors to achieve optimal positioning, to flank, to secure firing angles. But the Tyranids forced a terminal pathfinding failure. Read the specific coherency constraints for the Blood Claws infantry.
Pulling up the coherency statutes, a standard Space Wolf Blood Claw unit consists of 10 models mounted on 32mm bases. The rules of unit coherency dictate that for squads of this size, every single model must end its movement physically within 2 inches of at least 2 other models from its own unit.
Now combine the math. When a Tyranid monster completely blocks a primary movement lane with a 6.7-inch physical blockade, a 10-man squad of Space Marines on 32mm bases cannot simply flow around it like water.
Because of the 2-inch leash to their squad mates?
The required geometric spread of the Space Marine squad, mathematically bound by that 2-inch coherency tether, combined with the impassable terrain walls and the monster's invisible denial sphere, creates an impossible pathfinding equation. Because the primary vectors were plugged, the Space Wolves had to rely on secondary, suboptimal, elongated movement lanes.
Which heavily taxes their movement economy.
A Terminator unit with a sluggish 5-inch movement characteristic, or an Intercessor with a 6-inch move, simply cannot afford to detour around a geometric wall. It burns too much time. This directly resulted in the Space Marines consistently falling short of the critical objective marker proximities required for the Terraform mission parameters.
Ah, right. The Terraform mission specifically dictates that victory points are heavily weighted toward performing actions on objective markers outside the deployment zone. It forces a continuous, grinding, mid-board presence rather than static backline gun lines. You cannot win without physical occupation.
Yes. And to flip those terraformed objectives, the Space Wolves desperately needed their high objective control melee units to sweep the monsters off the points. However, the extreme defensive profiles, the 4+ invulnerable saves, and 5+ feel-no-pain mitigations of the Tyranid monsters bogged down the Space Wolf assault elements in multi-turn tar pits.
Total static suppression.
The Tyranid player executed an absolute masterclass in static suppression, turning the Space Wolf's diverse tactical toolkit into a blunt, ineffective instrument simply by refusing to field anything smaller than a tank.
Moving to the Turn 2 tactical records, this appears to be the defining vector of the game, the moment the mathematical disadvantage mutated into full operational failure.
Let us audit the psychological collapse. Proceed.
At the start of the Turn 2 command phase, the Tyranid commander Trey activates the faction ability, Shadow in the Warp.
The psychic terror weapon.
Yes. This macro mechanic forces an immediate army-wide battle shock test on every single enemy unit on the board. Furthermore, units within the proximity of a Tyranid synapse creature take this psychological test at a -1 penalty to their leadership roll. The Space Wolf commander, Luca, rolls the dice for his engaged units.
And what were the casualties of this localized psychic terror? Read the specific failures.
Looking at the command logs, the critical Bloodclaw unit, currently engaged and holding a primary objective, fails the test. Their objective control characteristic instantly drops to 0.
A completely neutralized asset. Who else broke?
The Redemptor Dreadnought fails the test. The Armored Transport, the Rhino, currently holding backfield assets, also fails the test. All 3 units drop to 0 objective control, and critically, they are entirely locked out of being targeted by friendly defensive stratagems for the remainder of the battle round.
0 objective control. They didn't just fail a test scribe. They entered a zombie loop, alive enough to consume oxygen, completely useless to the ledger.
But, it is only a temporary condition lasting a single round. Surely a veteran force can weather one phase of scoring suppression. I mean, it's just one turn.
A temporary condition. It was a strategic cascade of catastrophic proportions. Let me educate you on the bureaucratic weight of objective control. OC is not just a number. It is the literal mathematical measure of a unit's physical ability to secure territory in a hostile environment. When it drops to 0, the unit essentially becomes a ghost.
They cannot interact with the mission mechanics.
And it cannot claim ground. This single targeted phase denied the Space Wolves 4 primary victory points instantly. In a game heavily capped at a maximum score, losing 4 points on turn 2 is a fatal hemorrhage.
And the stratagem lockout.
It completely halted their operational flexibility by turning off their stratagems. Imagine a hyperdynamic Space Marine force reliant on stratagems like counteroffensive to interrupt melee combat, instantly muted. They were forced to stand there and take the blows. But the true terminal blow was to the detachment rules themselves. Read the mechanical requirements for the Space Wolf Saga of the Bold.
Let me locate the Saga parameters. The Saga of the Bold detachment heavily relies on heroic mechanics, specifically the completion of localized boasts to unlock army-wide buffs for the rest of the game.
What are the specific triggers for these boasts?
A critical boast requires an embedded character unit to land the final killing blow on an Oath of Moment target while simultaneously holding an objective marker outside their deployment zone.
Precisely. Focus on that last clause. While holding an objective. Because the Bloodclaw unit, which contained a character capable of fulfilling that boast, failed its battle shock test Its objective control plummeted to absolute zero.
Oh, so even if they secured the kill.
Even if they had managed the mathematical miracle of killing the Toughness 11 Norn Emissary with their localized penny stock violence, they were no longer legally holding the objective. The Shadow and the Warp structurally blocked the Space Wolf player from completing a Saga boast.
That completely stalls their momentum.
These detachments require a compounding snowball effect. Early character kills generate momentum, command points, and lethal buffs. By presenting nothing but hyper-durable monster profiles that couldn't be killed quickly, and then dropping the Space Wolves' objective control to zero at the exact moment they needed to trigger their army rolls, the Tyranids denied the Space Wolves their early boasts.
And without the buffs.
Without those army-wide buffs kicking in on turn 2, the Space Wolves lacked the mathematical output required to break the Crusher Stampede's hold on the terraformed objectives in turns 3, 4, and 5. It resulted in a systemic, game-long objective point lockout.
It is heavily noted in the battle report transcript that the Space Wolf commander directly blamed this phase. The commander stated that the Shadow and the Warp denied him 4 victory points in addition to unlocking his Saga that turn. He needed 3 of his boasts to be completed. He called it a game-winning Shadow of the Warp.
Of course he thinks that. It is the most common analytical trap in the galaxy to blame a localized, flashy mechanic for a deep-seated systemic failure. The Shadow and the Warp was not the executioner's stroke. It was merely the sound of the blade falling. The Adeptus Astartes' neck was already securely fastened to the chopping block during the list-building phase.
You do not attribute the operational collapse to the failed battle shock tests. The loss of scoring and stratagem seems mathematically decisive.
Let us mathematically remove the Shadow and the Warp from the historical record entirely. If every single Space Wolf unit had passed their battle shock tests with flying colors on turn 2, what would the physical reality of the board state be?
Yeah, they would retain their objective control and stratagem access.
But the Blood Claws would still be swinging Strength 4 chainswords, requiring impossible 6s to wound the central Norn Emissary. The Redemptor Dreadnought's Plasma Incinerator would still fail to bypass the 4+ invulnerable save and 5+ feel no pain of the Tyranid anchors. The Tyranid list was a mathematic brick wall. Shadow and the Warp merely turned off the lights in the room. The Space Wolves were going to crash headfirst into that wall regardless.
But the Rhino, the armored transport, it sat completely dormant in the backfield. The transcript notes the commander stating that the Rhino commits to wholly within the ruin there to fire a hunter-killer missile. It did not move to contest any forward objectives. It simply fired a single missile and parked.
It sat dormant because... Listen to this ventilation fan scribe. It sounds like a dying Grox. And this recap tastes like it was filtered through Munitorum issue boot.
Yeah.
Do you know what a single vial of decent quill ink costs in this sector?
Sir, the recording is still...
I know you civilians are sitting there gloss-brained, thinking you could balance this ledger better than me. You think you know how to crack a Toughness 11 floor? Prove it. I challenge you to descend into the comments section right now and attempt to correct my logistical math. You won't, because you can't. But I welcome the amusement of your localized ignorance.
Shall we? Shall we return to the turn 3 and 4 combat logs? The melee trade deficit is highly documented.
Read the grim details. Expose the cognitive overload that paralyzed the commander.
In the turn 3 melee phase, the Tyranid Haruspex declares a charge against the Brutalis Dreadnought. The Haruspex attacks with its primary profile, the Shoveling Claws.
Read the exact profile of those claws.
It generates 4 attacks, operating at strength 14, an armor penetration of -2, and dealing d6 + 1 damage per successful wound. The strength 14 attacks effortlessly bypass the Dreadnought's high toughness,
completely overriding the armor plating.
The Space Wolf player rolls 4+ armor saves, failing 2 of them. The resulting damage roll is sufficient to immediately neutralize the Brutalis Dreadnought, a critical 160-point asset in a single combat phase.
The biological reclamation engine performing at peak efficiency. The Haruspex is a masterclass in extreme points efficiency. At a mere 125 points, the adversary is confronted with a dual-threat disruption asset boasting 14 anti-infantry attacks and 4 massive anti-armor attacks, all wrapped in a Toughness 9 chassis.
It is incredibly cheap for that output.
Its Shoveling Claws, at strength 14, are specifically biologically engineered to reliably wound heavily armored dreadnoughts and Imperial vehicles on a 3+. It operates as a psychological wedge, forcing the opponent into a lose-lose targeting priority matrix.
A matrix, how so?
Do you ignore the cheap monster running at your lines and lose a highly valuable Dreadnought? Or do you pour your limited plasma fire into a low-cost distraction asset while the massive Norn emissaries sit on the primary objectives and score unhindered?
A brutal dilemma.
The Brutalis Dreadnought is a pure aggression engine. It was meant to act as a psychological terror weapon. But because it was deployed entirely alone, unsupported against the Crusher Stampede floor, it was simply erased from the ledger.
The slaughter compounds in the subsequent fight phase. The Swarm Lord utilizes the Epic Challenge stratagem. It specifically targets the Space Wolf Lord equipped in Terminator armor, challenging the leader directly out of the safety of his bodyguard unit.
Precision execution. Detail the strikes.
The Swarm Lord attacks with its Bone Sabers. It generates 8 attacks. Due to its Synapse aura, these strike at Strength 10, with an AP of -2 and a flat damage of 3. The Wolf Lord repeatedly fails his invulnerable saves against this precision onslaught.
Even with his embedded technological wards.
Even possessing the Fortitude of the Thunderwolf enhancement, which allows a potential revival upon death, the Lord fails the critical 2+ roll to return to the battlefield. The command structure of the central push is completely decapitated.
The Sworn Lord is not merely a combatant. It is a localized physical manifestation of the hive mind's strategic will. Its 60mm base size allows it to navigate terrain alleys with relative ease compared to the larger monsters, while its Toughness 10 profile still demands dedicated anti-tank firepower to displace.
It functions as a linchpin.
By pairing torrent-ranged weaponry with high-yield precision melee, it acts as a central Punisher unit. It forces enemies to pay a disproportionate tax in blood and resources just to exist in the center of the board. I want to highlight the Epic Challenge stratagem. It grants the precision keyword, allowing the attacker to bypass the ablative wounds of the bodyguard unit and strike directly at the embedded character.
Bypassing the entire Terminator squad.
Using Epic Challenge to surgically sever the Space Wolf command node was an execution of absolute tactical precision. But these melee traits, they are merely symptoms of the underlying rot. The true disease that killed the Space Wolves was operational paralysis. Read the Lictor deployment from the end of turn 2.
Pulling the tactical maps now. The Tyranid commander utilized the rapid ingress stratagem to deploy a solitary Lictor from strategic reserves. The Lictor is classified as a surgical disruptor. Its operational cost is extremely marginal, roughly 55 points.
55 points. Barely a rounding error in the grand scheme. Where did it drop?
By using rapid ingress at the end of the Space Marine movement phase, it infiltrates deep into the Space Wolf home deployment zone, far from the central conflict. By turn 3, it physically threatens to claim the undefended Space Wolf home objective.
And what was the Space Wolf commander's tactical response to this 55-point stealth bioform appearing inside his logistical supply line?
The transcript notes the Space Wolf commander verbalizing his thought process. He stated that he forgot about the asset, that he didn't zone out his backfield enough. He acknowledged it was going to hide behind the ruins threatening his home objective. The commander then actively chooses to continue advancing his rearguard forces toward the midboard meat grinder rather than issue a retreat order to defend the home objective.
This right here is the absolute apex of cognitive surrender. The infiltration and subsequent seizure of the Space Wolf home objective by a lone Lictor is a masterclass in asymmetrical resource taxation.
How does it tax resources if it doesn't fight?
The Tyranid player committed a marginal biological asset, 55 points, into the absolute rear of the Space Marine backfield. When the Space Wolf commander looked at that Lictor, a subconscious panic mathematical calculation took place in his mind. To reclaim that objective and secure his supply line, he would have had to execute 4 distinct, agonizing steps.
What are those steps?
1. Halt the forward momentum of a frontline unit desperately needed in the center. 2. Pivot that unit 180 degrees, completely abandoning their primary target. 3. Burn an entire movement phase just marching backward into his own deployment zone. 4. Risk failing a charge distance, or worse, failing to kill the Lictor through its 4+ invulnerable save, meaning the entire detour was wasted.
The cognitive load of executing those steps was deemed too high.
It was absolute operational paralysis. The cognitive load of diverting critical, heavy-hitting assets away from the towering, terrifying Toughness. 11 monsters in the center of the board to chase a solitary, insignificant stealth bioform in the rear was deemed too mentally taxing.
So he just let it happen.
The commander willfully amputated his own supply line. He surrendered a primary objective because the Tyranid player made the psychological cost of turning a model around heavier than the mathematical cost of losing the victory points. This is not a failure of dice. This is not a failure of statistics. It is the total collapse of command confidence. The Tyranid player won the secondary objective economy by exploiting human psychology.
The Space Wolves also abandoned their own deployment flexibility. The ledger details the abandonment of the Scout redeployment protocol. The transcript states the commander decided not to bring in his Scout that was in strategic reserves because he wasn't too sure what its goal was. He said he didn't really need its fire support.
Statistical and geometric futility. This is the ultimate triumph of the Tyranid spatial strategy. The Space Wolf Scout Squad possesses a highly specialized tactical ability to redeploy into strategic reserves and arrive elsewhere on the board on a later turn to score secondary objectives.
A very potent tool for the mission deck.
The fact that the Space Wolf player explicitly chose not to do this reveals that the Tyranid player had achieved total, suffocating board supremacy. Read the Biovore's operational mandate. Read how it shrinks the board.
Right. The Biovore, designated as a spore mine vector, its operational cost is 75 points. Its primary utility lies not in direct damage, but in its ability to fire traditional indirect weapon profiles or, critically, spawn a spore mine unit anywhere within 48 inches that is outside 9 inches of enemy models.
The Biovore artificially extends the Tyranid zone of physical control. By projecting spore mines deep into the empty space of the battlefield, it artificially shrinks the opponent's movement phase. Enemy models are physically forbidden from landing within 9 inches of a spore mine when arriving from reserves,
creating massive dead zones.
Between the massive 170mm monster bases, completely blocking the midboard transit lanes, and the Biovore's spore mines projecting overlapping 9-inch deep strike denial bubbles throughout the backfield, there were literally no tactically valuable coordinates left on the board to drop the scouts into.
The board was entirely saturated.
The Space Wolf commander recognized the sheer futility of the geometry and mentally surrendered the unit, leaving them in reserve. The Tyranid list was exquisitely designed to ensure the opponent simply had no physical, legal room left to maneuver into.
The Space Wolves were operating entirely outside their margins. Their datasheets were rendered mathematically obsolete, and their movement was geometrically constrained.
The Space Marines were pincered between an immovable biological ancel in the center and surgical scalpels dissecting their deployment zone. The Tyranid player won by changing the fundamental physics of the engagement. They operated entirely outside the margins of what the Space Marine datasheets were historically designed to solve.
Sir, if the ledger was so structurally deficient from the outset, were the Space Wolves doomed from the list-building phase? Was the battle fundamentally unwinnable regardless of tactical acumen?
A deficient ledger is merely an excuse for a lazy auditor. Any tactical deficit, no matter how geometrically or mathematically severe, can be salvaged with the correct operational doctrine. The hyperdynamic infantry of the Adeptus Astartes could not act as a traditional vanguard against the Crusher Stampede floor. The operation required a total inversion of the Space Marine paradigm. We must redefine the Astartes utilizing my custom mobile suit and funnel protocol.
I am prepared to transcribe the parameters of this protocol.
Pay close attention, civilians. This is how you save a bankrupt army. In this framework, the Space Marine Army ceases to be a collection of disparate squads playing hero and instead becomes a series of highly integrated combat nodes. Let us define the mobile suits.
The Dreadnoughts, presumably.
The Dreadnoughts, the Redemptors with their toughness, 10 chassis and native damage reduction, and the Brutalis engine must act as the anvil. They possess the 90mm physical footprint and the structural density required to anchor the center of the board. They must be aggressively pushed to the central terraformed objectives immediately on turn 1.
Creating a forward anchor point.
By anchoring the geometry with these heavy assets, the Space Wolves force the Tyranids to commit their primary melee threats into targets that actually require significant structural effort to break.
But what of the infantry? The Blood Claws and Intercessors swinging impotent Strength 4 weapons.
They become the funnels. They are repurposed into ablative chaff and spatial denial assets. The Blood Claws and Intercessors must be completely mentally detached from the illusion of lethality. You must accept they will kill nothing.
Nothing at all.
Their sole theological purpose against a Toughness 11 floor is to physically stand in the way. By spreading the 10-man squads out to their maximum geometric limit, maintaining exactly 1.9 inches of coherency between models, they create a vast physical net that surrounds the Dreadnoughts. They create omnidirectional spatial denial.
By creating this physical barrier, they are intentionally diluting the Tyranid activation economy.
Exactly. A Tyranid monster operates at peak points efficiency when it can direct all of its multi-damage, high-strength melee profiles into a single high-value target like a Dreadnought. By wrapping the Dreadnoughts in a cheap 32mm ablative layer of funnel infantry, you force the Tyranid player into a lose-lose mathematical trap.
How does the trap resolve mathematically?
Let us map Scenario A. The Haruspex charges the funnels. The monster effortlessly wipes the Bloodclaw squad off the board, but its massive lethal activation is entirely spent overkilling 140 points of low-tier, insignificant infantry. On the subsequent turn, the Dreadnought is completely free to countercharge and strike the beast unharmed.
And Scenario B?
Now, Scenario B. The Tyranid player recognizes the trap and attempts to bypass the infantry entirely to reach the Dreadnought. Because of the physical presence of the 32mm infantry bases tightly wrapping the Dreadnought, the massive 120mm oval base of the Tyranid monster mathematically cannot fit into engagement range of the Dreadnought without touching the infantry bases first. The Tyranid is geometrically locked out of its optimal target.
Brilliant manipulation of base sizes. But the transcript noted that the 40-bolt rifle shots peppered the Norn Emissary uselessly. If the funnels are not engaging in melee, what is the role of their ranged armament?
Pure, unadulterated suppressor fire. The 40-bolt rifle shots should never have targeted the Toughness 11 Emissary. They should have been relegated to sweeping the margins. They must strictly target the Tyranid secondary scoring elements, the 55-point lictors, the biovore, the fragile spore mines. You use the low-yield bolters to win the secondary objective economy, entirely ignoring the behemoths they cannot mathematically wound.
This brings us to the Terminators, the heavy assault infantry. The transcript details their deployment via the teleport strike mechanism in Turn 2. They arrived from reserves, attempted a crucial 9-inch charge into the central conflict, and failed the roll, leaving them stranded.
The Terminator deployment fallacy. The teleport strike mechanism is a psychological trap against a spatially dominant enemy. Deploying Terminators from deep strike reserves mathematically requires a 9-inch charge roll to engage in combat on the turn they arrive,
which is highly statistically improbable.
Without specialized rules granting advance in charge or native charge rerolls, rolling a 9 or higher on 2 dice carries a roughly 27.7% probability of success. It is a statistical gamble heavily weighted toward failure. When that charge inevitably fails, the Terminator chassis is physically stranded in the open,
exposing them to counterfire.
Their primary weakness, a sluggish move characteristic of 5 inches, becomes a terminal flaw if misdeployed. In this specific battle, the Tyranid biovore was actively seeding spore mines, projecting those 9-inch denial bubbles across the backfield. By keeping the Terminators in reserve, the Space Wolf commander surrendered control of their entry point to the Tyranid player's geometry.
How do we salvage their operational value within the funnel protocol?
The foot slog. To salvage their operational points value, the Terminators had to be deployed linearly on the physical board edge during the initial deployment phase, or at the very least heavily pre-measured to guarantee a turn 2 crash into an objective marker,
forcing them up the board manually.
A 5-inch movement characteristic dictates that they cannot react to a rapidly shifting battlefield. They must be pointed at a fixed geographical coordinate, a specific terraformed objective, from the very first turn and march relentlessly toward it, daring the Tyranid monsters to step into their path and intercept them.
That addresses the primary operational assets. What of the abandoned scout squad?
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier they were a casualty of cognitive surrender.
The masterpiece of the intellectual rebuild. The Damocles threat. The terminal flaw of the Space Wolf reserves was allowing them to be zoned out by cheap spore mines. The 65-point scout squad should not have been deployed to die. They should not have been deployed to screen. They should have been held in strategic reserve indefinitely.
Indefinitely. That removes their points value from the active board state entirely.
You hold them as the sword of Damocles hanging over the Tyranid home objective. By merely existing off-board, safely inside reserves, the scouts force the Tyranid player to solve an impossible point efficiency equation. You must understand the artificial unit cap of the Crusher Stampede.
The low model count of the monster lists.
By exclusively fielding massive monsters, the Tyranid player is heavily restricted to fielding roughly 10 to 12 total units for their entire army. They simply do not have enough biological assets on the board to simultaneously hold 2 home objectives, aggressively contest the midboard, perfectly screen out deep strikes, and perform secondary action mechanics.
The roster is spread too thin.
To successfully screen out a 9-inch deep strike bubble in their home deployment zone and protect their rear objective, they must leave a physical unit behind. In a Crusher Stampede, their cheapest defensive asset, aside from a frail spore mine or a lictor that should be dead to bolter fire, is a massive, high-cost bioform, like a 135-point exocrine or a 190-point Tyrannifex.
Oh, I see the calculation. By doing absolutely nothing, the 65-point Space Marine unit effectively neutralizes 135 to 190 points of enemy heavy ordnance, tying it to backfield guard duty.
Exactly. You weaponize the opponent's artificial unit cap. If the Tyranid player refuses to pay the tax, if they get greedy and move their heavy artillery forward to the midboard to help clear the Space Marine infantry off the primary objectives, the Damocles sword drops.
The spatial void is created.
The 9-inch denial bubbles evaporate. The scouts drop seamlessly into the unprotected rear arcs and instantly seize the Tyranid home objective, flipping the primary points.
And if the scouts successfully seize the Tyranid home objective, what is the geometric consequence for the Tyranid forces engaged in the center?
The movement phase tax. Total operational paralysis. Let us rigorously map the physical geometry of their counterplay. A Crusher Stampede monster has an average move characteristic of 8 inches. The physical distance from the midboard combat zone back to their home deployment zone objective is typically 24+ inches on a standard Leviathan layout.
A vast transit distance.
To reclaim their home objective from those pesky 65-point scouts, the Tyranid commander must halt a frontline assault, physically pivot a heavy asset, navigate back through the ruined choke points, and burn a minimum of 2 full movement phases just walking backward.
Burning almost half the game's duration.
In a competitive match, strictly capped at 5 battle rounds, forcing an opponent to spend 40% of their total movement economy walking away from the primary combat zone is a structural death sentence. By the time that Tyranid monster crosses the board and clears the 65-point scout squad, the game is functionally over. You have traded a marginal, cheap infantry asset for 2 complete turns of a behemoth's absolute irrelevance.
You have engineered a scenario where the Space Marine player wins the stat check by mathematically refusing to participate in it.
Instead of fighting Toughness 11 with Strength 4, you fight the objective math and the opponent's cognitive capacity to process geometry. The Tyranid player engineered their own potential defeat through an artificial unit cap and fixed geometry. We merely exploit it. The event horizon is created once a massive Tyranid bioform commits to a specific, narrow transit lane in the midboard. It cannot easily pivot.
Because of the 120mm oval bases.
If the Damocles threat drops in their rear arc, the Tyranid monster is geometrically locked. To physically turn a 120mm oval base completely around within the tight confines of ruined tournament walls is a physical impossibility within the turn limit. They cross the event horizon the moment they leave their deployment zone.
But the shadow and the warp. Does the Tyranid macro mechanic not still threaten the Damocles units? If they drop in, they could be battle-shocked, their OC reduced to 0, rendering the entire maneuver pointless.
The phase sequencing nullification, Scribe. The fundamental exploitable weakness of Shadow and the Warp is its rigid mechanical timing. The rules dictate it must be triggered specifically in either player's command phase,
which occurs before the movement phase.
Units that are currently held in strategic reserves or deep strike are legally not considered to be on the battlefield during the command phase. Therefore, they are entirely mathematically immune to the army-wide battle shock test when it is triggered.
Incredible. It creates a blind spot in the Tyranid's psychological warfare.
The bait and drop. Let us sequence the trap. If the Space Marine commander successfully anchors the midboard with the Dreadnought mobile suits and wraps them in the ablative infantry funnels, the Tyranid player will eventually panic under the sheer geographic attrition. They will trigger Shadow in the Warp in the command phase to try and break the choke point, hoping to strip the Space Marines of their OC and flip the central objectives,
committing their once-per-game macro ability.
The moment they expend that ability, the board state is permanently altered. On the very next Space Marine movement phase, the Damocles units drop from reserves directly into the Tyranid home deployment zone with absolute impunity. They arrive lucid, they arrive fully operational. They arrive completely immune to the psychological shockwave that was wasted on the midboard chaff,
depriving the Tyranid force of board oxygen.
Exactly. Even if the Shadow and the Warp successfully battle shocks the Space Marine midboard elements, what does it actually physically achieve? A battle-shocked Dreadnought still physically occupies a 90mm footprint. A battle-shocked Bloodclaw with 0 OC still physically blocks a 120mm Tyranid oval base from moving forward into engagement range.
The physical blockade remains intact.
The Tyranid monsters are still geometrically locked in the center. They cannot advance because the physical plastic bodies of the Space Marines are mathematically in the way, and they cannot retreat because the spatial distance to their home objective is too vast to cover. They are deprived of the geographic oxygen required to execute scoring maneuvers.
The ultimate cognitive collapse.
When the Tyranid player triggers Shadow in the Warp, they do so expecting a massive, game-winning swing in momentum. When the dice settle and they realize that the Space Marine physical blockade remains completely geometrically intact, the cognitive load spikes into the red. Then, at the end of the subsequent movement phase, the Space Marine reserves effortlessly drop onto the Tyranid home objective,
Triggering the realization of defeat.
The Tyranid commander instantly realizes 3 terminal facts. They have expended their singular macro mechanic, they are still geometrically trapped in the midboard ruins, and their backline logistical supply has just been permanently severed. The artificial unit cap of the Crusher Stampede means they have no spare biological assets left to fix the breach. The game is mathematically, geometrically, and psychologically over. That is how you balance a bankrupt ledger.
The audit is complete, sir. The structural failure of the Astartes engagement has been fully documented, dissected, and reversed through the application of the funnel protocol.
Close the ledger. Do we play the game, or does the geometry play us? You spend hundreds of hours painting these miniatures, assigning them names, dreaming up heroic sagas of courage and defiance. But in the end, they are just physical algorithms waiting to be executed on a grid. 80-bolt rifle shells, broken chainswords scattered across terraformed rock. They deployed with sagas in their hearts. But the galaxy doesn't care about your stories. It only cares about the math. Flish meets Kekton and the ledger balances, another company of heroes, reduced to red ink in a dying galaxy. For the love of the Empire, tap that like and hit subscribe. Dismissed. Pay your tithes, citizens.